without further ado, I think it's time for a little panel. Richa, what's happening?
Well, I'm hoping my phone doesn't ring and say seek shelter because we're in the middle of a thunder and tornado storm in the greater Philadelphia area. So fingers crossed.
Well, if it does, then you stay safe. I'll jump on and play your part for you. So then we'll also bring on who else do we have here? Mr. Willem. What's up, dude? And we've got
Hey,
Chris. Oh, this is a great panel. Where's Aparna? Yes. And last but not least, we've got Alex. But Alex, calling Alex to the stage. Where is he? There he is. All right. So there's a ton of us. I'm going to hop off. Richa, I'm going to hand over the talking stick to you and we'll get it started.
All right. Thanks, Ringo. Welcome, panel. Let's just take a quick second to go around the room, introduce ourselves, and then we'll dive right into the questions. I'll kick it off. My name is Richa Sachdev. I work for JP Morgan Chase, and I'm in the Chase Rewards department and lead a team of data engineering and operations. And we work on the business side to help them make data-driven decisions. I'll pass it over to you, Aparna.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Good to see you all. Excited to be on this panel. My name is Aparna, founder of Arise AI. Arise is ML observability and I guess LLM observability, which would be the topic of today. So excited to have a great combo with all of you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Aparna. Over to you, Chris.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris Van Pelt, co-founder of Weights and Biases. I'm repping the brand today. Our mission is to build developer tools for machine learning or LLM prompt engineering engineers.
Welcome, Chris. Alex.
Hey everyone, I'm Alex. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Snorkel. I'm also affiliate assistant professor at University of Washington. And before that, I was working on the Snorkel project at Stanford, all things what we call data-centric AI. So labeling, but also curating, sampling, filtering, cleaning all the data that goes into either training models from scratch or fine-tuning, pre-training, instruction tuning large language models or foundation models, as we like to call them. So excited for this chat, and Richa, thanks for hosting.
Of course, and this panel would not be complete without Willem. Willem, you're next.
hey, folks. Yeah, my name is Willem. Been in the data and AI space for about 6-8 years now already. Leading ML platform teams, ML infra teams, and building in the open source space. Recently, most focused on feature stores, but really sinking my teeth into the LLM space over the last couple of months.
Well, thank you all for being here. This is definitely a great panel, and I'm excited for all of the learnings. And Willem, nice to see you again. So I'll kick it off with you. Can you walk us through what do you think, in your experience, that the high-level differences between LLM ops and MLOps? And it's quite a tongue twister, LLM ops. I always make sure I have the right number of L's.
Yeah, I feel like this question we can probably expand and talk about for 30 minutes to an hour. So I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But I think a big part of it for me is abstraction and generalization. To me, LLM ops is language oriented, right? And so there's a big question around how you frame your use case as a builder to what an LLM can do, because it's so generalized. But I think we've seen a democratizing effect of these LLMs, bringing in new folks that couldn't previously traditional ML stacks and solutions. But I think a key difference for me is the offline flow, right? That's an area that has become somewhat optional right now. And I think for application builders, that has enabled new use cases to be unlocked, and for folks that weren't in the space to suddenly build, right? You can just start with a model in production, frame your use case around an LLM, and get that in front of users and get traffic onto that model, and then figure out the next steps. And the offline flow, whether it's data collection, whether it's training, that whole step has become a secondary step as opposed to the first step. And I think that's a key thing, and I'll kind of leave it there and let the rest of the panel kind of expand on that.
Yeah, thanks, Willem. Anybody wants to add on to what Willem just said?
Yeah, I mean, I think Willem's point was a really good one. You know, when we think about data scientists and ML engineers and what the workflow has been like for, you call it statistical AI, traditional AI. There's a lot of names I'm hearing floating for, you know, non-LLM type of models. But what happens is a big chunk of that work is in the training of the model. And I think that, you know, when we think about how do you go improve the outcomes, you think about, well, I'm going to go and train it to get X% increase in performance. That's become a fundamental shift in this new LLMOps world, is that there's so much you can do with prompt engineering. And actually, I think this is kind of what Willem's point was, which is in the, you know, the offline world might not look like training. It might not look like fine tuning. It might just be iterating on what is the prompt, what is the context that I might want to incorporate into the prompt. And it's a very fundamentally different workflow and different way of thinking about improvement than in the past, which is where, you know, for me, the one big thing I've been thinking about is, well, how does this change the persona? Does it, you know, are there going to be just data scientists who are building these models, just ML engineers? Does it potentially open up the persona a bit to, you know, I've actually already seen job postings for LLM engineers. And so does it open up kind of that persona for a wider audience because there's less of an emphasis on training and more of an emphasis on, call it prompt and prompt iteration. The one thing I do think will stay true in both MLOps and LLMOps, though, is it's very easy in the LLMOps world to I think try things really quickly, get a Twitter demo up, post it on Twitter. But just as an MLOps, very, very hard to get something to work robustly, work consistently. And so that happy to, I think, dive into that and talk about that more.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, it's interesting you're saying that probably the way the teams are going to be structured, the personas, the life cycle itself might change. But for like companies that are getting up to speed with the LLM world, I know like MLOps is still something that is not very easily understood. With the introduction of MLOps, what does it mean for companies to strategize? Can they take what they've already built and carry forward? Is it a completely separate initiative? So curious, Alex, if you have any thoughts around that.
Yeah, I'll respond to some of the great points that Willem and Aparna raised. I think there's a, I guess my short answer to your direct question is I think there's a lot of the MLOps infrastructure that is going to remain the same. And this has a lot to do with the appropriate models to actually serve in production for some subset of use cases. We often call them predictive use cases, classification, extraction, a lot of the traditional things that actually a lot of enterprise value still rests on today versus some of these larger, more generalist agents that kind of have open-ended, you know, Q&A, chat, dialogue, etc. I guess I already talked long enough that you know, I'll just cut to the punchline. And in my opinion, there's a lot of those tasks, more predictive tasks that still probably are going to make up a lot of the value that enterprises get out of AI. They can be distilled down, you know, orders of magnitude to traditional models. Basically, think of it as like going from a generalist to a specialist. One way that we've been thinking about these foundation models or large language models is as kind of first mile tools. Aparna, your point about, you know, it's very easy to make a demo, but the last mile still remains very, very hard, right? Everyone who's, you know, in AI knows that problem and knows that at least for a subset, especially of highly complex and valuable problems, that's not changing. That's why self-driving has been here next year for the last decade. That's why the last mile is always difficult. But you know, I think these big generalist models will give us a very powerful base to start the explorations and to we often refer to in our platform as warm start the problem. And then you need to train specialists that branch off of them. And those specialists can be much smaller and often will just look like a traditional ML model artifact. We had a paper with some one of my great students at UW and some Google AI collaborators on a new distillation approach, basically of kind of using a big model to teach a smaller model. But this is an old technique, and really, the intuition of how you can get this crazy result of a tiny model that's doing far better than the big model is it's just generalist to specialist. You don't always need a generalist jack of all trades that's hundreds of billions of parameters when you have a specific narrow problem you need to do really well at. So I think a lot of enterprise value, a lot of the problems that actually get shipped to production really are going to need specialists. And I think for specialists, we're going to see a lot of building off of big, often open source models that are more than good enough to give you that warm start. And then specialization, and those specialists will most likely run on existing MLOps infrastructure. So the serving infrastructure will look almost identical. I think when you truly do need a generalist, and I think we're still figuring out what subset of problems are real there. When you do need some kind of generalist co-pilot or chat bot, then it will look like a new type of serving mechanism, because then you can't shrink it down as much. That's serving. And then training, I've already talked too much, so I'll cut myself off. But training, I would just say, I think there's a chunk of the world that will look like, Aparna, what you were articulating quite nicely, where it's more about the prompt engineering. There's a chunk of the world where actually, because you're working on specialized data or high value use cases, you are going to need to continue training a piece of the model, an adapter, fine tuning, et cetera. Actually, a lot of that we're going to see converging in context learning and fine tuning. There's some cool new papers out about how those can be, convergent. So it will, in our view, come back to just the kind of engineering of the data and context you put into the model, whether it's through training, i.e. fine tuning, or through context windows. It'll really be more about that. So that's, I think, in summary, I think on the training side, it's going to be a lot about these data operations, whether it's a prompt or a tuned prompt or a prompt that includes a set of examples, which is now back to a labeled data set, or a mixture of all these things plus some external context. It's going to be all that data engineering. And then more so than the actual kind of hyperparameter algorithm model architecture selection. And then on the serving side, it's going to be kind of a split between these highly specialized models that'll look like traditional MLOps and traditional models, actually, would be my bet. And the kind of true generalist where you do need a gigantic model and the ops will look a little bit different. So that's my hot take, but I'll pause there. I've talked too long.
Yeah, thanks for the great insights, Alex. Chris, I have a question for you. So in your own world, when you're talking to different companies, data science teams, et cetera, practitioners that are in the weeds, how are they thinking about using open source tools, let's say for a financial firm? How are they making sure that the data is safe and it's easy, or is it safe for them to leverage the open source tools that are available out there? Or is there a lot of talk of trying to build some of these LLM models in-house as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say it's still early days. We're all obviously very excited about LLMs, but I think getting these into big enterprises doing real work is still yet to really happen in a meaningful way. I talk to security teams and data teams often, and it is a big concern to just send this data out to say something like OpenAI's API. They've mitigated this with allowing you to have kind of an isolated Azure native API in the case of OpenAI, but I think there's still folks that want to own the entire stack, or literally can't send out the data to any third party at all. And that's when either building something from scratch or partnering with folks like Mosaic to help build out something for themselves. And there's a whole there's a bunch of startups now just focusing on like, hey, we'll build you an LLM. It remains to be seen if that's a big burden to manage and deploy and deal with one of these large LLMs. So I think we'll still see where this ends up, but it's a bit of an unanswered question. The other day, it was, I think, early this week, there was a a startup on Hacker News talking about this exact problem. Like, we're trying to give better data observability and lineage and governance around, what is going into these things, potentially redact. So I think we'll see kind of where this lands, but it's definitely a big question on the enterprise's minds.
No, thank you. And the follow-up that I have is like, how are they thinking about the cost? As I understand, there's a huge cost associated. So how are the companies rationalizing it around the ROI that they're going to generate from it? Or is it still very early to determine that?
Yeah, I mean, it's expensive for sure. So, I mean, I think a lot of these bigger orgs, they have a budget and they can, very kind of rationally think about, would this make sense to take, this massive chunk out of the budget? But it's also still early, and there's a bunch of startups trying to make it a lot cheaper too. So, we'll see.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great progress. Oh, sorry, go.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying, I think there's a lot of great progress, to Chris's point, on startups and a lot of that coming from academia on just making these operations at all stages cheaper. And then you just have, I think as the space matures a bit, although these are all very classical ideas, you have these different stages you can start at. So it's not either start from scratch or take an off the shelf, API-based foundation model. You can take an open source base and you can, build off of that. There's various, there's a whole spectrum of kind of customization, kind of entry points. So I think a lot of organizations, these large enterprises that Chris talked about, that don't necessarily want to send all their private data to to an OpenAI, and don't necessarily have to, because the open source models, they're not quite as good right now as kind of general open chat and taking MIT entrance exams and LSATs and all the things that apparently baby LLMs do these days in their free time. But they are more than good enough to kind of base off of and build a highly accurate specialist. So you have all these options of kind of, where do I start and how do I specialize it? And I think in terms of cost rationalization, one of the appealing things is both being able to use this as a base for kind of jump-starting multiple downstream ML projects. If you have 100 teams that are going to use your foundation model as a base to speed up by 20%, that's a pretty good ROI calculus. And also, the cool thing is that a lot of how these foundation models are trained, it's not just pure, okay, go look and do self-supervision, train yourself. You can also use downstream specific tasks through what's called multitask supervision to kind of make it smarter. So basically, you can both get a boost for those downstream 100 tasks, but you can also create this powerful kind of data or supervision flywheel that makes the base better if you own that. So I think a lot of enterprises are getting quite interested in, what if I own that and I both speed up everything else I do downstream, but also kind of have this way of kind of collecting and scaling all the work we do. That's going to be very interesting. And it doesn't necessarily mean open source versus closed source. It just means they need to be able to own their copy of the model. And there's some interesting models from the cloud players and others emerging around that, along with open source.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Willem. Sorry, Alex. The one thing that we definitely should mention on that front too, we're talking about foundational model, the more private foundational models than the OSS foundational models. In both of those cases, I've been seeing a huge rise in using vector databases to be able to connect. That, it's another, I think about it as two ways. There's a privacy component where you might have to use an OSS model or build your own. But then there's also a connecting your data component when you're fine tuning or you're training up your own LLM. It's one approach to be able to give, your LLM context of your use case and your data. Another way of doing that, if you can use just an off-the-shelf LLM, is to be able to connect to a vector store and pull in context from, and I've been seeing a lot of different use cases for this getting actually deployed into production, things like chatbots, or I want to be able to answer questions on these certain documents. And what teams are doing is really supplementing the user queries with context from their own knowledge base. And it's a way less complex approach to building up your own LLM or fine tuning your LLM. As you add more documents or knowledge to your knowledge base, you can kind of augment it without having to retrain the whole LLM. But it's a great way to connect the LLMs to your own data. And the way I think about it is, if you can use an out of the box kind of public foundational LLM like OpenAI, well, you can directly call it, get back a response. If you need to connect it to your data, throw in a vector database. If it's still not giving you good responses, you want to fix a more general problem, you might need to fine tune it. And then if you really can't do any of those options, then I'd kind of, we've been seeing people then resort to using more of an OSS type of LLM. But typically that's kind of the process I've been seeing people go through to select the right approach for what makes sense for their use case.
I
like
want to
that
also
phrasing of like a.
I go for it.
Sorry, Willem, you go.
I think we should, if we have about 7 minutes left, hear any hot takes if folks have about how MLOps is going to change. But wanted to just tie back Alex's point and Chris's point on the enterprises. I think if you're mature and you have high value use cases, you probably have an evaluation stack and already existing systems in place. And for a lot of these companies, they have a little bit of leeway to try OpenAI or other mature models and do a like-for-like comparison offline. And I'm hearing that from a lot of folks I speak to. And if they have data sets already that are produced for or by ML systems, or even human labeling, they can already see how well these LLMs are performing. And then in some cases, they're cutting down 9 months of human labeling to minutes or hours of work. So there's definitely demand, and I think at a lot of companies, they see this as a differentiator. So there's pressure to get adoption, and now there's just figuring out like how do we actually do this, and they're exploring open source and other ways to do this reliably. But yeah, Parna, I'd love to also get into a topic of perhaps how does the stack change, right? Like vector stores versus feature stores, or any other kind of stack changes maybe on the observability side. Have you seen any kind of use case differences there?
Yeah, so that great question. So I think vector stores have definitely, I'm not the first person to say this, but vector stores are definitely a core part of what I'm seeing in the LLMOps stack. I think the embedding analysis and being able to understand, we've been doing it on the deep learning side for CV and NLP, but definitely something that's been cropping up more on the observability side for LLMs. And then one other nuanced point that I think I'd mention is that for LLM observability, if you are using a vector store, being able to trace back, was the right context added? If the right context wasn't added, how do you trace it back to, are the most similar documents that are selected necessarily the most relevant documents, or all the types of questions that we're getting asked and we're seeing actually our users troubleshoot in production. So I think the observability stack for LLMs will definitely need to have some components of looking at the vector store and being able to troubleshoot the context that was retrieved.
One thing that I think is different with LLMOps is exactly what you said, a part of this need to really debug or diagnose or get into these ever more and more complex chain of agents. All of the cool stuff trending it's pretty complex, and you can have many different calls out to different submodels or different services. And if any one of those things goes wrong, you're going to get a bad result. And then Willem, you mentioned this evaluation stack, companies that have a mature evaluation function. I mean, this is really important. We're getting a lot of software developers now using these things, and it works, and it's a cool demo. But if you can't measure how good it is, there's that's not going to be good in the long run, and it may degrade. And so I think these are the differences here, and you know, there's going to be a lot of tools that will hopefully help solve these things, but it's early days.
I think one way to look
Plus
at this was, go for it.
Oh, no, you go.
There's one quick point. I think the LLMs versus MLOps comparison puts them kind of at the same level. But another way to look at this is if you look at a feature store, you know, the features could be produced by an LLM, or it could be, you know, this is a system that is at a higher level and it compiles down your data pipelines, or produces the code, produces the features, and touches on the points that Alex made of the specialists, right? Like, you know, you could start with the LLM and then ultimately you have a more performant, perhaps more brittle, but reliable code-driven system that is optimized for your use case. And so they're not perhaps peers on the same level, but more kind of student teacher. Alex, you can go.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And with what Chris was saying in terms of how these systems, I mean, there have always been complex chains of interdependencies between deployed AI-powered applications, but the kind of democratization of that and the kind of blooming of complexity, we'll see how many of those actually get shipped to production. But you know, it's definitely kind of coming more to the forefront right now in really interesting ways that require this kind of, yeah, more software-like debugging through these long traces. I guess I can give a, let's see, a quick hot take, a medium take, and a cold take. I don't know, which is just like a lukewarm statement. But the hot take I already said is I think a huge chunk of the models people actually want to build, the problems they actually want to solve with foundation models today in the enterprise will just boil down to traditional ML models and traditional MLOps. We want to classify this. It'll start with a foundation model, but it'll end up with just a smaller model. And you could look at this and look at some of the mature deployers of foundation models for years. Like mainly, I'm referring to Google, right? They don't serve the biggest models in production. They distill down to smaller models, in ways like the work we did with them. So I think that's the hot take, is that a lot of LLMOps will just boil down to MLOps. As hot as I can get for a conversation this nerdy, right now when there's so much agreement in the group too. Maybe a medium take is, I think evaluation. I agree with, well, I'm agreeing, so not that hot. But evaluation, super important, super challenging. We've taught a generation of data scientists basically, not to peek at the test set, right? Don't test set hack, don't cheat. And what that has translated into is don't look at or think about the test set. And that's always been a problem in machine learning, right? You actually have to engineer your test set to be representative of what you want your model to do in production. That's actually still a problem for simple predictive models, but it gets tenfold messier when you now have you don't have a simple accuracy score. You need to build like a custom benchmark, and you need to be careful about where the data came from and whether it was in the training set of some gigantic, web-wide trained model. And so I think evaluation is very much in the hotspot right now. And a lot of these demos, they look amazing until you actually do a rigorous evaluation. And then you're like, it's still really cool, but it's not production ready, but we're baby steps there. So that's the medium take. And then the lukewarm take might be just that this goes back to a nice articulation Aparna you were making of kind of the steps of things you do. A lot of the questions that people are asking about, like, should I do a prompt or can I just rag it? I heard that phrase at Microsoft Build, retrieval augmented generation of putting in a context database, or do I need to fine tune? A lot of these are just pick the right tool for the right job, right? And it really is just, it's always the problem in data science is start with the simplest approach. And, in some cases, yeah, simple prompt, you'll get a great solution. And in other cases, well, your model is missing some context from a structured or unstructured data store. So plug in a database. In other cases, it's actually the ability to get the right decision boundary is not, even with the right information, is off. So you need to fine tune it. In other cases, it just doesn't have the good enough representations for your specific specialized domains. And now you actually have to pre-train. So, I think it'll all come back to, it's not an either or, it's just to pick the right tool for the right job. That's my lukewarm take. Kind of just plus one what Aparna said.
Yeah, you've all been a great panel, but I believe you've run out of time. Demetrius?
Yeah. So this is how I know. Oh, you can't see me, but this is how I know the panel's full of executives. They're right on time, literally 1 minute over, and they're like, "Shit, we're burning money here. We gotta go run businesses." So I love that. I just want to know, last question from me, and there's some incredible questions in the chat, so maybe we can convince some of you to go into the chat after this, but Alex said it already, so I don't need to hear it again. The rest of the panel, do I need to rebrand? Is it MLOps going away? Do I need to rebrand into LLMOps? That's what I want to know. Chris, I'll go with you first.
I'm in agreement with Alex's takes. I think it's spot on. It is still early days. We're all kind of like watching and wondering how this is gonna play out. But I don't think a rebrand is necessary. The core fundamentals of let's measure and have an auditable system of record is going to hold true, and that's good for my business. So maybe I'm seeing the world as I want to see it, but we'll wait and see.
I love it. Well, yeah, I mean, maybe a little biased from my side, but I'll go with that one. What about you, Aparna?
I feel like I'm gonna maybe be a little dissenter here. I think that it's definitely changed how people think about. I think the potential of LLMs is massive. I think it's changed how people think about, should I build this or should I just call an API and choose that approach? I think the world of today, LLMs probably don't replace all of traditional ML use cases. Come on, it's so expensive, it's latent, it's not going to work for internet scale applications. But there's some things that I can't imagine people, like sentiment analysis or classification. I can't imagine people continuing to build models for that when an LLM does so good right out of the box. And so I think, it's probably not an overnight, we're all LLMOps. And we're kind of living in this middle ground of statistical AI is still the most commonly deployed ML that's out there, but LLMs are coming for us. And I think all of us are kind of thinking about, well, I actually just had a call this morning where they said CEO has 3 LLM initiatives, and those are the biggest projects that our ML or DS organizations focused on. And it's a little bit of, I think, this wave that's coming towards us, and I think we should, the needs of this model type or this new wave might be different. So being able to adapt to something, I think we're all trying to do.
Yeah, I think from my side, MLOps rolls off the tongue a little bit better. So I think you're safe on that front. But I 100% agree with Aparna. I think I'm excited about the new use cases that it unlocks. Reasoning and judgment, certainly. These agentic flows, and the debugging thing was an important point earlier. There's a lot to be learned still. I think it's early days, but nobody's ever said there's an existential risk to us from XGBoost, right? There's clearly a step change with LLMs, and we're all waiting to see how this impacts us over the next couple of years. But yeah, I think for now, wait and see is the best course of action.
And
Demetrius, I got to get a word in. You were trying to pull a fast on me. I think it should be FMOps.
I know you said that last time. I'm
bigger fight.
That never happened, and keep ignoring it. We can't have another ops, man. Give me a break. There's too many ops. So yeah, foundational model ops does make a lot more sense, though. I will give you that. So Richa, last one before I kick everybody off. Is it in or is it out? Am I rebranding or what?
No, you're in for the long haul. You've got the right name and you're going to stick to it. And we all know you as somebody who founded this community, and we're going to stay true to it.
There we go. All right. So thank you all for this insightful chat. I do not know if I have ever been on a virtual call with so many hard hitters before, and it is an honor to be able to say that I rub shoulders with you all. And for those that are in San Francisco, I'll be there in 2 weeks, so hopefully we can meet in person. I'm going to kick you all off now because we got some trivia games to play, but this has been absolutely awesome. Thank you all for the fun times and insights and good stuff.